Let's go back a page here. Oh well. All right, so this is the DBA Fundamentals virtual chapter, and we are actually talking today with Brent Ozar. He is our speaker, and his session is going to be on free downloads for powerful SQL Server management. So I have been looking forward to this for quite some time. I think I know at least some of the things you're going to mention, but I want to see how many I get right. So
cool.
First and foremost, let's go over a few housekeeping tips here. Let's see. Our main thing that we like to mention first are our sponsors. Without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to bring you guys all this wonderful content. So our main sponsor is SentryOne. There's a lot of stuff online. You can go on SQLperformance.com as well as their blogs. They have a lot of videos as well as downloads, including a free plan explorer. So go on out there and check that out, century1.com/plan-explorer. They also have some free query tuning advice. So go to answers.sqlperformance.com for that. And there's some other content information for them on Twitter and LinkedIn and that type of thing. The other sponsor we have is DB Watch, and they actually have a solution for the complete data management, including administration, monitoring, and things like that, but also security and license management, so it includes much more. Check them out, dbwatch.com. They have also their software you can get a free trial for and such, and they've got videos and articles. It's great. I've been out there. You can find them on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube as well. We are the DBA Fundamentals virtual chapter. It's one of the reasons you're here. We have 4 organizers, Shane, Steve, Kevin, and myself, Glenda. And so our content information on Twitter is up there. We're also on the DBA Fund at DBA Fund Twitter handle. You can check us out there. Our YouTube channel actually has a lot of sessions, including some of the past that Brent has given on dbafundtube.org. You can also email us, and our Slack, we have a channel in the Slack community, and let me tell you, it's great. I'm always out there, and whenever I get a moment from work and I don't want to do something, I go to Slack and start talking, so it's awesome. We are a member of the overall organization of PASS, and they have a lot of different virtual groups. This is listing I believe all of them now at this point, so as you can see, there's quite a bit of variety. If you're looking for something, there's probably a virtual group out there. There's also in-person groups as well. So if you go to pass.org, you can check out a whole lot for the different groups. Here are some upcoming sessions. I know that we've got the business analytics, business intelligence, and of course today's with Brent Ozar, another business intelligence, hybrid, Hebrew, Italian, and another one with us starting in early February.
So why am I the only one that spell check caught? Why am I the only one that's got a fuzzy underline under my name? Stirrup isn't underlined. Oh, Radney. Okay, good. Radney. All right, good.
Another great opportunity for learning our SQL Saturdays. And I know that I was introduced to them back in 2012, and I have never looked back. It's been wonderful. I don't know if I have all the most current up here at the time, but there is the February 12th in Cleveland, February 9th in Redmond. But check out SQLSaturday.com for all of the events. They're a free day for you just to go and meet people. I've actually met several people, Grant Fritchie and Steve Jones, and you can just walk up to people and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and really get a lot of networking in. It's a wonderful event. And lastly, this session, along with others, but this session will be available on dbafundtube.org within about a day or two. So with that all taken care of, I'm going to pass it over to Brent.
Dun, dun, dun. Hello, everybody. How's it going? Let's see, I'll get my, make myself
presenter.
Betcha. All right, let's see here. Let's show screen number 2. Show my screen, and off we go. Jump back one slide. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about powerful downloads for SQL Server management. All the links to everything that I'm going to talk about was published in a blog post this morning that you can get to at brentozar.com/go/free stuff. There will be a lot of URLs through the course of this. You don't have to worry about writing them all down. And sometimes I'll even just tell you Google for certain terms because the URLs are really long and hard to remember. Or if you just go to brentozar.com/go/free stuff, it's all there. You are someone who has to manage lots of SQL servers and you don't have enough time in the day. I always thought as a database administrator that I was running behind, that I couldn't take care of everything I needed to take care of. And I used to try and cobble my own stuff together. I thought I'm going to build a little army of tools that I would use throughout the course of my career. Well, thanks to the open source revolution, now there's all kinds of people contributing their own work into collective projects. I tell you what, in the year 2019, you shouldn't be writing your own DMV queries from scratch. You shouldn't be writing your first PowerShell queries from scratch for the first time. There's a huge community of other people who do exactly the same thing you do. And so today I'm going to show you some of the tools that those folks have built over the years. I'm Brent Ozar, used to be a database administrator, and now these days I'm a consulting DBA. I just go around and talk to different shops who are having performance emergencies or reliability emergencies. And I'm going to show you some of the tools that I use when I'm either working with clients on their servers or teaching them how to do a better job of managing their servers. The things that I'm going to walk through initially are SQL Query Stress, SP Who Is Active, the First Responder Kit, Ola Holland's maintenance scripts, and SentryOne's Plan Explorer. I'm going to show them to you on SQL Server 2019, but everything I'm going to show you works with all currently supported versions of SQL Server. Let's go get started. So I'm going to switch over and share my desktop instead, a little VM I've got over here. So I've got SQL Server 2019 installed, and I've got the Stack Overflow databases. Stack Overflow is completely open source databases. It's the same databases that run stackoverflow.com, but just, of course, it's a cleaned up exported version. It's not like your passwords are inside there. Now, I love this for doing things like load testing demos. And I bet if you're like me, you need to sometimes throw a bunch of load at a SQL server, and you don't have a really easy way to do that. Well, the first thing that I'm going to show you that's totally free, it's called SQL Query Stress. Now, SQL Query Stress was originally written by Adam Mechanic, the same person, Boston area MVP, who is behind SP Who Is Active, another tool that I'm going to show you here in a while. The way that SQL Query Stress works is that you can point it at a database server. Here, I'm going to just point it at my local server. The period is a shortcut for localhost, does basically the same thing. I'm all about minimizing keystrokes, so of course, period is what I'll usually use for stuff like this. Then I can pick which database I want to go hammer. Let's go bang on SQL Server Stack Overflow 2013 and click test because I love to succeed. Woohoo! Now, in here, you put on the left-hand side the query that you would want to run. So like, say, select star from table. But it's not really fun to run just one individual query over and over again, because then you kind of know exactly what you're going to expect. What I'd rather do is run a bunch of different random queries against the Stack Overflow database. So when you Google for SQL Query Stress, you're going to find a bunch of articles about how to go use it. One of them is one that I wrote that gives you a bunch of free queries against the Stack Overflow database, so that if you want, instead of doing a select, you can go USP random queue, like a USP random query. And this stored procedure will go and run a bunch of different queries against the Stack Overflow database. They're all read-only in this case, just doing all kinds of really ugly selects. Now, the way that SQL Query Stress works is that you can put in the number of queries you want to run. Let's say I want to run 100 instances of this USP random query, and I want to do it across 10 threads, go. The way that this is going to work is there are 10 different threads right now, SQL Query Stress, that are running, each of which will run 100 queries. So you're talking about 1,000 queries that are going to run all together. Now, you'll notice iterations completed. It's not going very quickly because these are purposely very crappy queries. If you want to go see what's going on my SQL server right now, one way to just go look that the server's in trouble is 100% CPU. That's what we call bad. So let's say we want to troubleshoot what's going on with our SQL server. Why is my CPU running like 100%? When someone calls me up and says, hey, Brent, what's going on the SQL server right now? The first query I go run is the open source SP Who Is Active. Now, and of course, my computer is going to run a little bit on the slow side right now because I'm nailing it with 100% CPU. What SP Who Is Active does is it shows you a list of who is active. There's a query originally written by the same guy who wrote SQL Query Stress in the beginning, Adam Mechanic out of Boston. And this has been proven across more than a decade of use, SQL servers all over the world under the ugliest performance situations. So you can be pretty confident that this thing will return fairly quickly given its defaults. The first thing that you can tell when your server's under really bad pressure is that if SP who is active takes more than a couple seconds to respond, you are in really big trouble. What SP who is active returns is a list of queries that are running from the oldest running query to the newest running query. So this one up at the top's been running by default for 51 seconds. I'm going to go ahead and cancel my load test because good night. This poor SQL server is going to be in a world of hurt. So it gives me the longest running query to the shortest running query in terms of time. I get the query, I get the things that it's been waiting on. For those of you who've been playing around with wait stats, or if you've seen like Paul Randall's wait stats session at the DBA Fundamentals session as well. Which queries are using TempDB? Boy, I tell you what, this comes in so incredibly useful for me when TempDB starts growing, or if I know that TempDB grows every night at 5 p.m. and I need to understand why. There are a bunch of scripts out there that will let me log SP who is active to a table. I can set it up to run every 5 minutes overnight and just schedule it during the windows that I want. Then that way I can know when I go back in the morning which queries were running that were filling up TempDB. If there's blocking going on, I can see that as well. I can also see where the queries are coming from. Now in this example, they're all my own queries because I'm running the load test. But in real life, you can see which app servers they're coming from, which desktops they're coming from, who it is that's hammering your SQL server, the app that it's coming from, and much more. Now, by default, if you even just knew SP who is active, that by itself is just absolutely wonderful. You may not ever need any more parameters than that. There are two parameters, though, that I absolutely love using. I don't use them all the time, but when I need them, they come in very handy. Get plans equals 1 and get locks equals 1. I don't use both of these by default, and I don't use both of them at the same time. I'm troubleshooting two different problems. When I'm trying to figure out why a query is running slow, that's where get plans equals 1 comes in really handy. That gives me the execution plans of the queries that are running. It takes a little bit more time, which is why they don't turn it on, why Adam doesn't turn it on by default, because you don't always need query plans. Then get locks returns you an XML property bag of the, now that's kind of a weird term, it returns you an XML field with a bunch of data about the locks that are being held by a session and who's blocking who. In order to show it to you, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a lock. I'm going to go ahead and start a new query in another window over to the side. And I'm going to say begin tran. You would surely never do this in production. Update DBO users. Let's just make everybody feel better about themselves at Stack Overflow. Set reputation equals 1 million so that everybody can feel like John Skeet. Go. Now you'll notice that I don't have a commit inside here. All I did was begin the transaction and not commit it. So if anybody else wants to query the users table, I'm going to start having a world of hurt here in a minute. I can fire off my load test, and some of those queries are destined to be blocked, just like you have problems in real life. Hopefully your users don't leave transactions open. I'm going to move that session over here to the side, and I'm going to come back to SP who is active again and run it with get plans equals 1 and get locks equals 1. So now I've got a couple additional columns in here. If I scroll across to the side, I've got query plan and I've got locks. So before I go into those, I can see here's the begin tran that did an update. You can click on it if you want to see it formatted a little more nicely, like the way that the user sent it in. And I can see who ran it. In the case that I'm blocking other people, like 72 is blocking other folks here, you can see who's being blocked by who. Anytime you see stuff in the blocking session column, that's usually something to be worried about. There are all kinds of other cool parameters Adam's got when you're facing a blocking emergency, like finding the lead blockers. I'm going to scroll back on across to the right. Let's say that I'm really interested in this user who's blocking other people, who's doing an update of users. And I want to see what kinds of locks he's holding. Let's go cancel that so I don't have to worry about that. So let's go click on the locks column. I don't expect my developers and DBAs to be able to interpret this right away in real world situations where this XML field is going to be huge. But for example, it's easy to interpret here in the Stack Overflow database on the users table. This query has an exclusive lock on the entire object. I'm updating all the rows. This becomes really useful when you need to kill a query, because whenever you need to kill a query and you're looking in things like SP who is active or SP who2 or whatever, you only see the most recent query that the user ran, not all the queries that led them up to this point that caused you the blocking emergency. So when you go to kill their query, you better know doggone sure everything that they did inside that transaction. And it's hard to tell. It's much easier to tell with SP who is active because I can see if this XML thing is a big long wall of tables and I'm like, oh my God, they touched like 50 tables. And if I look over in the rest of the columns, there's also a writes column here. It tells you the number of 8K pages that this thing modified. Holy smokes, he modified a lot of data. It might take a long time in order to do that rollback. Now, another thing that's really useful when I'm troubleshooting slow queries, let's say that I've got this problem over here. What is this? Select count accepted answers. What's this query doing? If I want to troubleshoot why it's running so slowly, one of the things I may want to do is look at its execution plan. And SP who is active makes that really easy too. When I passed in get plans equals 1, I can then go click on the query plan column and it gives me, here's the execution plan of the query. Even better, you'll notice I'm using Management Studio 18. It's a new preview of an upcoming version of SQL Server Management Studio. It's mostly production quality now. You'll see it have freeze ups and kind of jerking around movements from time to time. But one of the things that I adore it for is look at the numbers underneath each operator in the plans. See how it says like 9 million out of 17 million, 53%? This is a live execution plan that shows the progress of this operator as the query's running. Now, live query plans is a whole nother ball of wax to pop into. This is something that got a lot better in newer versions of SQL Server. Starting in 2019, it's even on by default. In older versions of SQL Server, I say older, 2016 and 2017, you had to turn on trace flags in order to get this all the time. I'm not a big fan of running it all the time, but when you need to troubleshoot why a query is slow, I can see, he's working really hard on this one clustered index scan. And in Management Studio 18, I can see the row estimates right there on the plan instead of having to hover my mouse over it in order to see what the estimated and actual are so far. Now, I like Management Studio, and it keeps getting better, and execution plans keep getting better. But it can still be frustrating because a lot of stuff is hidden from me by default in the plans. It can be really hard to know why a query is running slow. A lot of things don't jump out at me, like real implicit conversion problems as opposed to fake ones. That's where the next free tool comes in. I can right-click in here and I can say View with Sentry One Plan Explorer. Obviously, this doesn't ship by default because you may not have seen it in your machine before, but it's a totally free tool from Sentry One, who's a third-party company that happens to sponsor this exact webcast. No affiliation with them or anything in terms of that with the webcast. It's just that it's a really cool free tool that I would use, and so should you. It gives me a better view of execution plans. You install it on your desktop, not on the SQL Server. And when you do, you get this nice, easier, more compact execution plan view. It's a lot easier to zoom things in and out and change how these line widths work. Why is it that in every frickin' application, even in the year 2019, zoom to fit never works the way you want it to? Come on, party people. So in here, usually you're used to with Management Studio, the arrows on execution plans, the arrows don't always represent what's really going on inside the plan. Notice here in Sentry One, it shows you the number of rows that are flowing through each operator. Plus, you know how costs in here, the costs are color-coded by red? You can change what the costs are shown by. For example, by default, it's a mix of CPU and I/O. If I'm troubleshooting a query that's reading a ton of data and I want to figure out which parts are reading a ton of data, I can switch it over to just purely costing by I/O, or just purely costing by CPU. There's all kinds of things that this thing does that makes my life easier, much, much easier in terms of troubleshooting. And I can't begin to do it justice, just like I can't begin to do SP Who is Active justice inside this webcast. But the goal of this is to show you where these free tools are at and start your learning journey going down those free tools. So that's pretty cool for analyzing execution plans. Could go way deeper into that one. But what happens after the emergency's finished? So now in this case, if I go back to Task Manager and I see what's going on with the SQL Server, it's fallen back down to nothing. There's nothing going on it right now. What happens when the emergency's over and someone calls me up and says, hey, why was the SQL Server slow like 20 minutes ago? Because you know they almost never get you right now. It's always happening when you were at lunch or what happened at 6 p.m. last night. That's where the next free tool comes in. So the next free tool is SP Blitz Cache out of the open source first responder kit. Well, let's be a good person and let's close our locks here, do a rollback, and then move him back into my old tab group to give myself just a little bit more space. For those of you too who haven't been playing around with the seeing things jump between multiple windows, if you think that's cool, another thing that's really nice is see how nice and tight my tabs are, as opposed to yours probably have a whole string of stuff like the server name in it and all kinds of other things. Go into Tools Options, and there's a ton of stuff that you can get inside, just inside SSMS in terms of tools and options. If I go down under Text Editor, Editor tab, and Status bar, I simply turn off everything in the tab text except for the file name, because really the file name is all I need in order to quickly identify what I'm doing on a particular tab. That way, I can save my tab, let's say Diagnostics, and I can see right away what the tab name is. I can even pin this, and then it'll stay on a specific place in here. I can even put the pinned tabs in a different row in Management Studio. So like if I go down in here, I can do the search, tabs and windows, and then it is show pinned tabs in separate row, and okay. And now, boom, the stuff that I have pinned stays up at the top, even when I have a ton of windows going on here. It makes it way easier to see, oh, here's the one that's my favorite, the one that I'm working on a lot. I can also name my files things like before and after when I'm doing query tuning for easier visibility. All right, so I'm going to go now and do the next query that was out of here, SP Blitz Cache. Now what SP Blitz Cache does, this one's from firstresponderkit.org, is the GitHub repo. SP Blitz Cache will look at your plan cache, your SQL Server's analysis of the queries that have run most often recently, the ones that have done the most logical reads, that have burned the most CPU time, you name it. And it gives you kind of a leaderboard of the 10 queries that sucked the worst. I like to call this the sucker board, which is queries that suck fantastically. By default, it's doing sort order equals CPU, but you could change that if you want to do reads, executions, duration, memory grant, and much more. All kinds of sort orders that are open in the documentation. Now, by default, it's sorting by CPU. So if I go over, everybody immediately wants to jump into the query text. Hold that thought. It's really just kind of a placeholder to show you what the query is. If I go scroll across to the CPU column, I can see that this is sorted by how much CPU time each query has used in total. Maybe it's been called several times. The number one on my list has been called 3 times. It burns 75 seconds worth of CPU on average when it runs, which makes for a total of 225 seconds worth of CPU. When you run this out in your real world, it makes it real easy to go quickly see which queries you should focus on tuning. I'll tell you what, often as a performance tuner, I used to be so confused because people would bring me the slow queries and say, here, this one is the problem. You should tune this. And I would tune it and they would still be frustrated because what I didn't know was that the server was getting brutally murdered in the alley by like an application server that was continuously running queries, and no one was looking at the app server. It was just pummeling the SQL Server to death. But when I went into things like the plan cache, I could see, oh, this query runs all the time and it's screwing me. As soon as I make that go away, all of a sudden I have a whole lot less performance problems on the server, and everything else performs faster instead of just the one query that Mary wanted me to tune. So in here, I'm looking at the queries sorted by the most highest CPU. For each of these, if you want to sort by averages, you can do that as well. Now, this one was originally written by Jeremiah Peshka and then since maintained by Eric Darling out of ericdarlingdata.com. And they do all kinds of really cool XML analysis of your query plans. Because really, at the end of the day, query plans are just stored in XML in memory. It's just a matter of writing XML queries, like I'm ever going to do that, to go analyze what's going on inside the plan. So you can see right at a glance, before you even open the plan, you can go through and see, James says, oh, James is giving me tips about zooming. Yep, I'm totally aware of that. I was just pointing out that the zooming didn't work. So in here, I can see, before I open the plan, I can see, oh, I'm going to need to look for table variables when I go click on this, so that then I can go click on the query plan. I can go through and see what all this thing is doing. And yep, sure enough, he's adding a table variable and then trying to dump a bunch of stuff into it. This is the thing that I should probably focus on querying or coding, fixing, especially when it comes time to getting data back out of that table variable. That's going to be a completely incorrect cost. Has all kinds of warnings in here about different things, non-sargeable stuff inside my queries, high compile time. And a lot of these warnings you may not be familiar with in terms of a performance tuning. For example, say I look at this and I go, forced serialization. I have no idea what that means. Well, that's where this little decoder ring, the second result set, comes in. It'll tell you that these are the things that it found inside of the query plans. And then you can use those to go copy paste them, go into a web browser, understand exactly what's causing that forced serialization thing, and how to go about fixing it inside your queries. So this is really useful. This is only one of several queries that are all inside of firstresponderkit.org. You can play around with those, lots of documentation and videos on those separately. The next thing that we want to go do is go protect our SQL Server and make sure that it's safe and sound, that our backups are done, that our indexes are being rebuilt when we want and the way that we want them, that corruption checking is happening. And maintenance plans are okay. They're not a bad way to get started. It's just that you tend to hit the limitations of them pretty quickly, especially in older versions of SQL Server, 2012, 2014. I know, can you believe that I'm calling them older? And you just got excited to go install your first one last week in production. So when I hit those walls and I want to start doing a better way of doing corruption checking and all of that, that's where Ola Holland's stuff comes in. If you go to ola.hollengren.com, this is a member of the community who's written his own completely free open source maintenance scripts. He calls it Ola Holland's maintenance solution. You can go download the whole thing, and it's one big old ginormous T-SQL file. There's lots of documentation. Just like you, I'm not going to bother reading it. I'm just going to go click on it and go copy paste it into production because, that's how I roll. I can just hear my critics in the background going, that is how he rolls. That's exactly what he does. Man, I sure would like it if when I clicked on a file, SQL Server Management Studio would just know to open the frickin' thing in my existing version of Management Studio that's over here, but that's a little bit too much to ask. So let's go over into downloads where Ola's script went in. Now, there's tons of email or tons of lines inside here if I page down. And I'm going to tell you that I just go over, it already runs into master. It does this by default. I'm just going to go ahead and click execute. But if you were a good, responsible production DBA, you would read all of this code and understand what it's doing. You're not going to do that. So you're going to do what everybody else in the world does. You just execute it. And then you go over to your list of jobs and refresh them. And you got a bunch of new jobs inside here that you didn't have before. These are Ola's. Doing your database backups, cleaning up your command log, integrity checks, index optimizes, and that's it. Output file cleanup, I think, is already there. So let's say we're going to start with our backups. If I want to right click on here and go into properties, it's not scheduled by default. When Ola script's installed, he wants you to go through and set up schedules for the jobs that you care about, because maybe you don't care about doing corruption checks. You should always care about doing corruption checks. So it's up to you to set up the schedule. And then he's got a set of steps in here that are the defaults. You may want to change these. I'm going to click edit in here. Remember, we're backing up the system databases. What he does is he calls his own new stored procedures. He's added a few new stored procedures over in master for backing up your databases, doing index rebuilds, and so forth. You can tweak these parameters. I'm going to tell you how I set these up myself. Verifying your backups sounds like a really good idea, and it is, but I'm not usually a big fan of it on the production box itself. I am usually a much larger fan of restoring my databases somewhere else, like in a development or staging environment. Until the restore happens on another box, I don't usually feel that safe and comfortable about my backups. Can tell you a lot of horror stories about backups that were working successfully, but then some yo-yo was deleting the files after they were taken. Or maybe it was my script that accidentally had the wrong date settings. So when you do verify your backups in production, it just takes much longer. And if you're worried about your backup windows becoming longer and longer, go check to make sure that you're not doing this. If you are, think about start restoring your databases on another box instead. I am a huge fan of checking your checksums on backups. By default, when SQL Server takes backups, it does not check the checksums on the 8K pages as they roll through. It just assumes that any page that comes through should be backed up. SQL Server will happily back up corrupt databases all day, every day, and not throw a warning. So this will make your backups take just a little bit longer, but it's like a really cheap, crappy way of getting some corruption checking. It's not cheap and crappy. I mean, it's cheap. It's not really crappy. It's a good way of getting some corruption checking, just as you happen to be getting backups. Man, every minute that I can get of advance notice on database corruption, I want it. The sooner that I can get it, the better. Then that's the backup commands. He's also got, let's see here, where is my database integrity check? We'll go into here. Look at the steps on this one. And then he's doing this with different jobs for system databases and user databases. I'll be honest, I bet you're like me in that your master database model and MSDB aren't really all that big. So if you want to keep your life just a little bit simpler, you could deal with one database integrity check job that does all databases instead of splitting it up into system and user, just to make your life easier. And then last, in terms of corruption checking on this, or in terms of Ola setups on this, for index optimize, in here, by default, he doesn't show you what your thresholds are for defragging versus rebuilding and the ways that you do rebuilding. Like, are you rebuilding online? Are you rebuilding offline? In order to really understand the ramifications of that, go into master, go into programmability and stored procedures. And here's some of the stored procedures that got created. So his, for example, are database backup, database integrity check, and index optimize. I'm going to script out index optimize just so that you can see what the defaults are on here. I don't want you editing the defaults, because sooner or later you're going to go replace Ola scripts with the latest versions and you're going to forget that you changed the defaults. So what I want you to do is copy paste out the parameters that you're thinking about changing and put those parameters in the job step rather than changing them here. But for here, it's just really easy in terms of teaching you how this stuff works. So by default, Ola says, if your objects are more than 5% fragmented, go ahead and do this medium fragmentation step. However, if they're more than 30% fragmented, do this high fragmentation stuff. And he does it in terms of priority. This is freaking genius. It's absolutely amazing. He says, it's almost like the coalesce command. Take the first way that you can rebuild this index and do it that way. For example, if you can rebuild the object, do it on. If you can rebuild it online, do it online. Otherwise, if you have to take it offline, that's a lower priority. Same thing with defragging between 5 and 30%. If you can reorg, do it. If you can't, due to the way that the index is created, the fields on the index, whatever, your addition of SQL Server will stop you from rebuilding online, for example. If you can't do this, then degrade to this. If you can't do this, degrade to this. A couple of things that I would change if I was you when you go and set up these jobs by default is, first, I think these are a little bit ambitious. I don't know that I would go through and churn a bunch of objects every night, especially if I am setting up this job to run every day. I might go with higher thresholds than this. So maybe say 30% on the low end and maybe 70% on the high end. The exact threshold that you choose is completely up to you. The other thing that I would change is, I don't know that I would take an object offline just because it had hit my lower fragmentation number. Because in a lot of 24/7 environments, I don't really want a table going offline unless I'm there to see it. Like, I'm okay doing rebuild offline during a maintenance window when I'm around, like if I have to go in on the weekend and do something on my SQL Server for other reasons. But if I'm in a 24/7 shop, a website, I have nightly jobs running, I might take out this index rebuild offline part. And the way that you would do it is just simply delete it out of this step, and you would delete it out of here, so that the rebuilds offline only happen when you want them to happen manually. There's no reason that you can't use these exact same stored procedures. Like if I go into index optimize, go into properties, there's no reason that you can't set up a totally separate agent job with different thresholds. For example, one of my favorite things to do is set up a nightly job for statistics that have hit past their thresholds, for example, and then only weekend jobs for index maintenance to do the reorgs and rebuilds, especially in Windows where I know that I have serious maintenance issues. One other thing that I might poke around with, two things, I guess, both right here next to each other: time limit and delay. Time limit is how many seconds that the job is allowed to run for. And if once one step goes past that, it'll automatically just bail out at the next possible opportunity. Say you set it at 1,400 seconds or something. Obviously, you'd go higher than that. 15 minutes, something like that. You'd go higher than that. Why am I giving you sample numbers? You know how to make random numbers up. You don't need to tell me that. You could set it whatever hour you want, and then after that, so if this thing's in the middle of rebuilding an index, it may stretch past that, especially if it's a large object. So just know it can still violate that timeline. The delay parameter is really useful if you're doing things like database mirroring or always-on availability groups, where you want to give the replicas some room to catch up, like some breathing time in between rebuilding every object. Otherwise, if you've got like all solid-state storage, you may be able to rebuild 100 gigs of indexes in a matter of seconds, but then the poor network is getting absolutely hammered trying to push all this stuff over to your async replicas. Delay just makes your life a little bit easier there. Lee asks, can we use index optimize in Azure SQL DB? I don't personally use Azure SQL DB. I do use Azure SQL DB managed instances. I just haven't had a case yet where I've needed to use Azure SQL DB. Your best bet would be to read the documentation in there to go check. But I love that you're asking, because this is something that's still up to you to do, as opposed to something that's left up to Microsoft to do. They don't proactively go out and rebuild and reorg your indexes, because of course this burns up your DTUs. This burns up your performance that it may not be at a window where you're comfortable with. So they leave that up to you to do that kind of scheduling. All right, so that is Ola Holland scripts. Let me come back to the slide deck. Pop back out of here. Lee says, thanks, you're welcome. John says, if I'm using transactional replication, would the delay parameter be important? So my thing usually with transactional replication is, trying to think of a polite way to say this. I don't really have a polite way to say this. And of course, this is why y'all like me. I'm not a huge fan of replication because it seems to break right when I open up the margarita. It's not like margaritas need to be opened. Right when I start drinking the margarita, that's immediately when replication breaks. It's never at the time when I want, like when I'm sober at the keyboard. So I don't tend to use a lot of transactional, let's be honest, I don't use any transactional replication. I think it's a cool technology in the same way that I think skateboards are a cool technology, but I don't ride skateboards either because I'm old and those things will hurt me just like replication will. It's a great question though. And immediately, as soon as I say that, people are like, well, what should I use instead? Man, I wish I had an alternative. Just if you need to do replications, you just need to do replication sometimes. I'm a huge fan of log shipping and always on availability groups. I'm just not as huge of a fan on replication. When asks, this may be beyond the topic today, but just out of curiosity, what does your job warm up memory do? When gets a huge bonus points for looking at my agent jobs list. Warm up memory, whenever I start up my VM, what it does is it does a select count star from Stack Overflow's biggest table so that I know that my memory is all fully warmed up, because by default, SQL Server doesn't use all of the memory right away. I want to gradually use all of it. You could play around with things like lock pages in memory. I just don't always need all of the memory, so it only fires up when SQL Server starts up. Fun trivia. So everything that I talked about in here, all that stuff is all up on the screen, the URLs for those. But then there's much more that I'd love to go into, but of course there's only so much time I have in a given webcast. First one is Redgate's free books. Redgate does a phenomenal job of publishing really good books, and you can go buy them through Amazon or whoever your favorite bookseller is. And I guess you probably should, in the sense that you should support the authors. But I know a lot of us, especially the 350 of us on this webcast, we don't have enough money to go buy all of the books that we want, or sometimes we just want to go see samplers. So if you Google for Redgate books, and no, I'm not telling you to go to a torrent site or a pirating site, Redgate actually gives away their books on PDF for free. So you can go in and get all kinds of cool books about replication, about in-memory OLTP, about all kinds of cool topics, execution plans. Grant Fritchie's got a great book on execution plans. The URL on it is just long and complicated, so I don't bother putting that up here. Just search for Redgate Books. The one thing to know about that when you get to the page is that there are tabs across the top underneath where it says Books Topics, and click on the different topics so that you can see even more books. It's just not the 3 or 4 books alone that you see on the screen. There's like 2 dozen. If you want to manage more servers in less time, now, if you manage, I think that one DBA can successfully manage, and by successfully I mean not have a bunch of outages, manage between 10 and 50 instances of SQL Server. But the higher you make that number, the more SQL Server instances that you have, the harder it is to manage them at scale, because you just need to do so many things on a daily basis. An instance will break. You'll have to add a login. You'll have to change an agent job. There's all kinds of day-to-day housekeeping stuff that you have to do that they like to say that the robots are eliminating in the cloud, but they just seem to keep happening. PowerShell is a good starting point, but the problem is there are so many things that you have to do as a DBA that you have to keep doing that aren't included in the box. And that's where DBA Tools comes in. DBAtools.io is a totally open source set of framework commandlets that you can use to do your daily job much better and faster. They're also a vibrant ecosystem of contributors. There's lots of people there who will help you either use the code or contribute code to others. Alex asks, do I use DBA tools and DBA checks? See, I'm a consultant with a fake job. Whenever you talk to people who are consultants, they usually end up giving advice to other people. My phone doesn't ring in the middle of the night because a drive filled up. I cashed out of that. I'm kind of done with that. If I took that job again, if I wanted to be on call again and manage a bunch of servers day to day, DBA tools and DBA checks would be a big thing that I would go and run to. I just don't use that myself. I want to make sure you know about it, but I just don't use it myself. Do as I say, not as I do. Oh, you should really do as I do and get out of the on-call business, because boy, I tell you what, it does feel really good to crack open that margarita at 5 p.m. or whenever it is. Sometimes 2 p.m. Hey, that's the life of a consultant. Checking for corruption at scale. I talked about one person managing 10 to 50 instances. Well, that's one thing in terms of instance quantity. There's another thing in terms of instance size. As your databases grow to 1 terabyte, 5 terabytes, 10 terabytes, it's really hard to do corruption checking on them, especially even if you offload it to another server. You can't just restore a 10 terabyte database and run CheckDB. You're not able to do that fast enough. That's where Minion has some really cool stuff built into their CheckDB tool, where you can go off and break the CheckDB up into chunks. You can schedule it to break it up across different servers, all kinds of powerful stuff that you can do. I don't generally recommend this for stuff that's under a terabyte, because under a terabyte, you can usually CheckDB on your own. But when you break past a terabyte, it becomes really hard. Quest Spotlight Basic for monitoring servers. They don't make this very easy to find. You kind of have to Google for it, Quest Spotlight Basic or Spotlight Essentials. And they have a totally free tier that you can use. I want to say it lets you manage up to about 5 servers. And it's not as complete and in-depth as a good monitoring tool, but it's free. And I know the folks in here, of course, a lot of us don't have any money to go buy third-party tools. So that's kind of fantastic. Learning past conference videos. Man, I know when I was a database administrator, it was hard to get approved for a training budget to go to big official conferences. The travel, the hotels, all that stuff. One of the cool things about community conferences like past.org and SQLbits.com is they publish their past videos on their websites for free so that you can then go watch in from the stuff from last year, 2 years ago. And a lot of that is all still good, relevant stuff. So many of us are still running SQL Server 2014, 2016. So the conference videos from 2016, 2015 are still massively valuable to all of us. You will have to put in a registration email for past.org, but I tell you what, it's free and it's totally worth it because after all, you're hearing a past webcast, right? Then managing Columnstore indexes. They are not self-maintaining. Every now and then I see that bad advice out from folks. Nico Neugebauer out of almost at Portland, but Portugal, has written a fantastic set of Columnstore index scripts. If you search for CISL, that's his column, CISL, CSIL. I have a typo there on the slide. CSIL GitHub, and that's Columnstore Index Library. Free newsletters. SQL Server Central is put on by, I think, Redgate. Yes, Redgate. And then MS SQL Tips is another independent site. Both of those put out daily emails that are chock full of tips, which are just utterly phenomenal. Now, of course, they're both daily emails, so they're going to kind of beat up your inbox a little. But don't feel guilty about setting up a rule, dumping them into a folder. Just delete everything in it when you don't have time. But when you do have time, it's an interesting way to scan through headlines. And I almost at least always find one good link out of each one of those newsletters going, oh, that's something I didn't already know. I should dig into that. Another way to learn a lot is by reading Glenn Berry's scripts. So Glenn Berry out of SQLskills.com has a really cool set of diagnostic scripts. And it's also really useful for diagnosing a production SQL Server that's having problems. But you know what it's also good for is teaching yourself stuff about how SQL Server works. Because he's got a lot of comments in there and talks to you about different DMVs, what those DMVs have, why they're interesting to him. I'm always so happy when I come back to SQL Server after working on Postgres or Aurora, because there's so much fantastic diagnostic stuff available inside SQL Server, all totally for free, all in standard and developer edition as well. And then lastly, something that I use at least once a day. Sooner or later, somebody hands me a query when I'm working over a remote desktop and we have to work together and I want to just clean up the version on the screen, format-sql.com. That redirects you to a page on Redgate's site, but it's just so much easier to remember format-sql.com. Cleans up the T-SQL. It may not be the exact format that you prefer, but boy, I tell you what, it's way better than unformatted T-SQL. And then I got all kinds more stuff over there at brentozar.com/go/free stuff that I just published today, including a link to Konstantin Taranov's fantastic resources site of all kinds of free tools, an inventory of every known SQL Server trace flags and its effects, links to all kinds of tools, all kinds of great stuff. Nicola asks, well, that's not really related to tools, so I'm going to skip that one. Joseph says, are there any great solutions for managing jobs in an always-on failover scenario? The problem that I usually run into with syncing jobs, Jonathan Cahias has an application that syncs jobs across servers, but the problem I usually run into is I usually want different versions of logic across different agent jobs. Sometimes people will put in logic in an agent job and it only ever works on the secondary, and they won't put in logic in the code to check to see if it's a secondary. So I don't always have the luxury of syncing the exact same job across every server. So I haven't seen a good opportunity for that, like an easy utility, but DBA Tools does have tools to sync stuff across availability group members. If you want to do like a canned quick version, that PowerShell commandlet's probably your best bet. And then the last thing that, well, nope, somebody deleted it talking about Slack. So All right. Well, that's everything that I wanted to talk to y'all today about. Glenda, is there anything that you want to sum up with or say thanks to our sponsors or anything?
Well, I wanted to make sure a big thank you to you. I know it's been, I always love catching your sessions, and I know you bring in a lot of people because everybody loves watching your sessions. So
Oh,
thank you, thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you. My
Make
pleasure,
sure
everybody.
make sure you guys check out all of our future sessions as well. We have some booked out all the way through. I think our furthest one is like September or October or something like that. So make sure you guys check out. Brent will also be back in July talking about SQL 2008. So if you love watching him, you can watch him again there too. So all of those sessions are on dbafun.org, also our contact information and such. And again, this will be available on YouTube, dbafuntube.org. And lastly, thank you everyone and have a great day. See you guys soon.
Adios, everybody.